QA1 front coil over install. I'm installing these coilovers on my 1970 Olds Rallye 350, but the principles probably hold true for all GM cars from this time period. First step is to remove the front shocks, and if your shocks have been in the car as long as these have, a little bit of penetrating oil is probably a good thing to have on hand. Removing the shock is pretty easy. Just take off the top nut and then go underneath the control arm, and you see the two bolts there for the shock T-bar. Take the bolts out and just simply slide the shock out. The next step is to remove the anti-sway bar standoff, and the threads on mine were a little gummed up, so it took me a while to actually get it off, so I sped the video up quite a bit so we don't sit here watching it all day. And the next step is to remove the brake caliper. And the way I do it and the order in which I do it may not be the same as what other people do, but I think as long as you do it safely and you end up with the same result, I think it's okay. To do the job safely, a spring compressor is a must. Now, this is an inexpensive tool, and if you're a guy that's doing this kind of work somewhat frequently, like even every 3 or 4 years, then spend yourself $35, $40 and buy one of these tools, and it can save you from getting injured. Now, one thing I didn't show is disconnecting the tie rod end, and it's simply remove the cotter pin, take off the nut, take a pickle fork in there and give it a couple whacks and it comes out. I like to remove it because it allows me to turn the spindle with any direction I want, and it's real easy to disconnect it, and and you know, hooking it back up is even easier. So it's one thing I like to do. I had to remove the bottom control arm bumper because the way the spring is wound, the coils are pretty tightly spaced, and I had to take the bottom part of the spring compressor and slide it into the spring sideways, otherwise I couldn't get it in. Before compressing the spring, I loosened the upper ball joint nut. Then I spun the nut down so about half of the nut has thread engagement. That way, if I don't compress the spring enough and the spring still has a lot of tension on it, if I pop the ball joint loose, the nut will catch it and keep it from getting away from me. Now if you compress the upper control arm down and the spindle nut has a gap where you have some free play, then it's safe to go ahead and remove the nut. When I lower the control arm, I take my time and I try to keep an eye on everything. And in this instance, I want to make sure the brake rotor isn't hanging up on the jack. So just keep an eye on everything, make sure everything's free and clear, and then just go ahead and lower it down nice and easy. No big rush. Now you can see that the control arm can be moved somewhat freely. That means the spring's not putting a lot of pressure on the control arm, so that means we can manipulate everything safely. To remove the spring, I just used a small crowbar, hooked it underneath the spring, and then just popped it out. Spring nuts for the original shock absorber need to be removed, and in this case they just slide onto the control arm, so I just use a screwdriver and pry them off. We need to make sure we get this area of the control arm clean so we have a good contact between the shock T-bar and the control arm. I took the bolts supplied with the coilovers and the right hole the bolt slid into easily. The left hole is going to need a little bit of cleanup. So I took a drill bit just slightly larger than the holes and just cleaned the holes up a little bit. I just took just a few thousandths off. But we want the bolts to slide in and out of the holes pretty easy, so it's easier to get the shock bolted in. I needed to clean up the control arm a little bit. There's a bunch of grime and grease and gunk on it. And part of me wants to pull it out and clean it and paint it and all that, but I need to stay focused. So I just gave it a preliminary cleaning, brushed it down, and called it good. QA1 recommends you coat the shock with anti-seize to keep from galling. So I did that. And I also used their thrust washer kit, which has a Torrington type bearing that helps you when you want to adjust the spring. It doesn't bind on the spring. When installing the shock, you install the top first, and if you put your hand up through the fender liner, you can feel where the hole is, where the original shock would come through, and you can kind of guide the shock up through there. You put your rubber isolator on there, then the steel retainer and the nut, and that'll hold the shock in place. I just use a screwdriver to pivot the T-bar so it's aligned with the control arm. So when I try to bolt it up and I raise up the control arm, they sit pretty squarely. You can see here by cleaning up the holes, we can get the bolts down through the control arm really easy and get the nuts started. Once I have the bolts through and the nuts started, then I go ahead and raise up the control arm so the control arm makes contact with the T-bar, and after that I just tighten the bolts down. The next step is to bring the spring up to the ride height you want. Now in my case, I have really no idea where it's going to end up. So what I did is I just brought it up 1 inch from the base, and I'll start from there. Now that I have the preliminary spring height set, I'm going to go ahead and connect the spindle to the upper control arm. Ball joint castle nut doesn't need to be super tight. Just snug it up and then adjust the nut until you can get the cotter pin through the hole. And use the same process for the tie rod end. You don't need to get it super tight, just snug it up and then adjust the nut so you can get the cotter pin. Now since our ride height is now different on the right side than it is on the left side, I had to go over on the left side and take the anti-sway bar loose in order to be able to connect everything up. Now, in order to make it easy to get the caliper on, I take a pair of vice grips and I compress the piston into the caliper. Now, if you look at the piston, you can see it's slowly being squeezed into the caliper. And what that does is when you put the brake pad in there, it gives you a little bit of free play and it allows the caliper to slide into place. A quick note here, when you remove the caliper initially, you don't want the caliper hanging by the brake line. So bend up a piece of wire and then hang the caliper up from one of the holes in the frame. Well, that's it. The install is complete. Now we're going to need to come back and adjust the spring height. But right now we don't know where that is. So until we get the car back on the ground, this is our starting point. Now the shocks are adjustable, but I just left the valving in the position they were supplied with. And you know, I'm not going to take it out and burn corners with it. I just want the coil over so I can set the ride height of the car.